I think this is meant as a warning. President Trump speaks with sometimes exaggerated language to make more of a point. And what he's saying is that Iran cannot take anything for granted. And that clearly, even though the United States was not involved directly with the military operations, they clearly knew this was coming. And the United States has effectively been supportive of Israel's very rapid dismantling of Iran's nuclear power infrastructure, which has now continued into dismantling part of their military and defense infrastructure. So I think we can read this as President Trump simply saying to Iran, that basically the United States will back Israel if needed. That's not really a change in foreign policy. It's just a difference with how this president communicates that. Well, President Trump has made it a point to always talk about getting negotiations and getting a good deal. It turns out that Iran, it appears, was not negotiating in good faith. That was also somewhat expected. Iran has for years struggled at the negotiating table with presenting a credible case and presenting that they are credibly negotiating in good faith. But President Trump has made it quite clear he would like a negotiated solution. I think that by the fact that Israel has taken the lead on the military actions and that the United States has demonstrated clear but indirect support, it does leave the option open for the United States to negotiate with Iran for a deal that fundamentally works. And that deal will have to be that Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon. It's a very straightforward proposition. If Iran decides that it will no longer pursue a nuclear weapon, I think the United States is willing to come to the table with a very good deal for Iran. I think it's more of a show of force right now. It's showing Iran that the United States is serious. It's also preventing further escalation against U.S. Assets in the region, whether they be civilian or military. Because if so far Iran has retaliated only against Israel. Now they have retaliated against Israeli civilians, not their military assets. But there is clearly a line in the sand that President Trump has drawn and said that if American interests are harmed, that the U.S. military will immediately take part in the war operations. So I think that's meant to show Iran how serious the United States is, and I think that's why Iran right now has not attacked any U.S. military or civilian assets. We're in a very unique situation. I think Israel was probably always part of the negotiations, even though it wasn't overt. I think that the threat was always there that Israel would take action on their own. It appears that the United States understood this, and it appears that they appear to have given Israel the ability to go and act unilaterally. So it's a weird negotiating style. It's basically the U.S. is telling Iran, "Hey, we're not actually part of the military operations," but realistically, I think Iran knows that if the United States is able to negotiate a deal, that they have the leverage with Israel to prevent Israel from any further military action. So I think effectively it is a three-way negotiation. But on the one hand, the United States is saying we're not part of the military operations, and Israel is saying they're not part of the diplomatic operations. But that's a little bit more for show than it is out of substance. Well, I think the United States is a credible actor that they can influence Israel to stop the military strikes. And there's some cultural reasons why, obviously, Iran, it's difficult for Iran to directly negotiate with Israel. I don't see that as happening. So when you're dealing with negotiations, the real question is about credibility. And I think the United States clearly has the credibility to go to Iran and say we can broker an end to this war. And I think Iran knows that the U.S. can do that. So Israel does not have to sit at the table to be an integral part of the negotiations because of the dynamics of the situation. Iran is not credible right now as a good faith actor in a negotiation. It's quite clear that their nuclear program was designed for weapons, and it's quite clear they were farther along than what they had said before. So, for Iran to go to the United Nations and say that Israel is the reason the negotiation is failed is simply not true. The reality is that if Iran wants peace and if they want security, they have to be able to credibly give up their nuclear weapons program. President Trump has made this very clear. The international community has made it very clear. So again, but Iran is not credible because they've been coming out to the international community and saying we don't have a military nuclear program, and yet now we see, because Israel has largely destroyed it, that they were lying to the international community and they did have it. So Iran's going to have to be much more straightforward if they want the international community, the United States, the United Nations to take them seriously. I think at this point, it's clearly focused on eliminating Iran's nuclear program. It's quite clear that despite what Iran was saying, they don't have a civilian need for a nuclear program. They've been saying they wanted it for medical and things like that. Clearly, that wasn't the objective. It was to create a military nuclear program. Realistically, I think the United States views this as a certainty that Iran will be disarmed of their nuclear program. Israel right now is the country that is orchestrating the actual attacks on Iran to that end. But I think that I don't see any scenario where the United States allows Iran to have a nuclear weapon. Now, with that said, I think the United States is in a unique political situation that is very different from where we've been in the past. And I think that President Trump would uniquely be willing to do a different type of a deal, an economic deal with Iran, if they're willing to put down their nuclear aspirations. However, the current regime in Iran does not seem interested in that. And the longer that this goes on for, I think the more likely it is that we are going to see a regime change in Iran become both the internal policy for Iran and the external policy for other countries. Well, I think it is somewhat connected because after October 7th, obviously Israel took a much more proactive stance in the region, and that was a major change. And then now you have President Trump has been a significant change since taking over from President Biden, and the U.S. posturing in the region. And the political map is definitely being withdrawn or redrawn. You see President Trump uh, opening up very good trade relations with Qatar, with Saudi Arabia, and with the United Arab Emirates. Meanwhile, Israel has substantially demolished Hezbollah in Lebanon and Hamas in Gaza, and those were proxy militaries of the Iranians. And so I think it's indisputable that you're seeing a completely new political map, which has some level of threat, but it has a lot of opportunities as well. I think there's a strong likelihood of that, particularly if there's regime change in Iran. If you look back historically, there's really no reason why there should be animosity between the United States and Iran, or necessarily even Israel and Iran. But right now, the current regime that's running Iran has a very bad relationship with the West, and many of their other neighbors as well. And so I think that there's one of two outcomes that'll happen. It's a foregone conclusion that Iran's nuclear program will not be allowed to exist. So either the regime will stand without a nuclear program or the regime will be overturned. If the regime is overturned, I think that there will be potentially a new era for Iran to re-enter the global community, to have new trade. And again, I think the United States historically would not have been so open to that. But President Trump is a different president than we've seen in the U.S. before. And so it's entirely possible to reshape the region with economic deals if the current regime in Iran is in fact toppled or is evicted from power as a result of what is going on. Well, it's hard to say. I think that the military capabilities of the militias has been substantially diminished. In the original airstrikes, Israel also fairly substantially decapitated the leadership in Iran that was controlling the militias. So I think right now they're fairly diminished, and I think if they had the military capabilities that they had a year ago or 2 years ago, they would be bringing them to the table. I think what you're seeing is that Iran is right now wholly incapable of standing up to Israel's military. And if it escalates, then Iran doesn't just have Israel to stand up to; they have the United States. So I think that this will likely be resolved fairly quickly. I don't think it'll escalate a whole lot farther, but we could see some escalation. But I don't think the militias are going to play a particularly big role because they've lost their leadership and they've lost a lot of support from Iran. Well, I think it's somewhat nuanced. I mean, in the same way that Iran says that it does not have control or abilities over Hezbollah and Hamas, um, there's a lot of things that are said that people understand are more complicated than a simple explanation. Israel is a sovereign country for sure, but Israel's biggest ally is the United States, and so it, Israel is in one sense acting fully autonomously. But I also think it would be naive to believe that the United States didn't fully support what they're doing. And because of the way that this is being presented, it does leave the door open for the United States to come in as a potentially honest broker for a peace deal, and because they can credibly bring to the table that Israel will stop bombing Iran. So it's an awkward setup, but it actually kind of works for this situation. Well, politically, it's very hard for anyone to take a side on this against the U.S. and Israel because Iran clearly has been lying to the world about their nuclear program. You have to remember that for 60 days, President Trump was openly attempting to get Iran to negotiate in good faith. Iran was saying that they didn't have a military nuclear program, and today it's quite clear that Iran has been lying to the world community, and I think most people expected that. So I think it's very hard for most countries to find a lot of sympathy with Iran when there's been a good faith attempt at negotiations, and to have them not acquire a nuclear weapon. I don't really know many allies that Iran would have in them acquiring a nuclear weapon. I think the world is a much safer place with Iran not having a nuclear weapon. They've clearly been trying to build one. They've been dishonest about trying to build it. I don't expect them to get a lot of international support. Well, they're generally in some ways allied with Iran, but I don't think Russia or China actually want Iran to have a nuclear weapon either. They're happy right now to compete directly against the United States. They're both nuclear powers, and that gives them a level of significance in the world. Iran, as a nuclear power, is a much different story. It doesn't really help China or Russia. It doesn't counterbalance the U.S. It could proliferate nuclear weapons, nuclear bombs to other non-governmental entities. So there's a lot of bad things that could happen, and I think even for China and Russia, who are allied with Iran, it's probably very difficult for them to support them getting a nuclear weapon, which is what this is all about. Well, if those reports are true, I haven't seen them from an outside source, but I believe that absolutely it could be true. First of all, the United States will not be attacking civilian targets. So Iran is attacking civilian targets in Israel. The United States, if they are participating, for sure, what they're going to do is attack some of the hardened military targets. So what Israel lacks militarily are hardened bunker buster missiles and bombs to take out the deep Iranian nuclear sites. So if the United States engages in sending aircraft over, I would guess, and my background, I was in the Air Force, so this is very near to me. My guess is that they would be sending over support to take out the Iranian nuclear facilities using some of the more advanced US systems. I don't think that you're likely to see American air power translate into civilian casualties in Iran, definitely not on purpose. But if the United States Air Force engages, it's almost certainly to destroy the very hardened Iranian nuclear facilities. If that's true, again, like I said before, I think the United States is very much on board with fundamentally destroying Iran's nuclear capabilities. And I think that the decision that the Iranian regime has is, are they going to give up their nuclear ambitions and try to get a peace deal with the United States and Israel, or are they going to go all the way through and Israel and the US will simply dismantle their nuclear capabilities? I think that increases the likelihood of it. I also think it increases the likelihood that internally the pressure builds for the regime to be toppled from the inside. Reports are that the current regime in Iran is fairly unpopular with the population. The United States always has a policy, as does Israel, trying to minimize civilian casualties, particularly on these types of very sophisticated airstrikes. And so, if it is true that the United States air power is engaging, I think it's also a sign that it'll be harder and harder for the Iranian regime to stay in power, just because I think the citizens of Iran are may very well get fed up with their own leadership. So we could be seeing that happen as well. I would assume that it's predominantly to eliminate the nuclear program of Iran. It is the United States has been very clear that Iran will not get a nuclear bomb. Iran has been lying about their process. That's been exposed. The Israelis have exposed it. The United States intelligence probably also knew that this was true. So I think the United States is very skeptical of getting into wars in the Middle East right now. The population is not supportive of that. I think the population is probably supportive of limited military incursions, and that it's more likely, given the political climate in the US, that the United States would eliminate the nuclear capabilities of Iran. And the byproduct of that may very well be a regime change, but I think it's unlikely in the current political climate for the United States to forcefully push for a regime change. First of all, I don't think it'll last very long. And there's a lot of other oil supplies out there. OPEC has plenty of oil. I think there are other impacts on the price of oil than simply this. So I think this introduces some volatility into the international political environment. But from an economic point of view, Iran has been pretty well secluded. I don't see this having a huge impact on the markets. And I think that most people expect, especially if the reports are true that the United States is engaging, that this will likely come to an end fairly quickly.